day today. We will begin with a panel discussion led by our own Professor David Jones, Research Director of the Danube Institute. I'm pleased to introduce Timothy Egan, President and CEO of Canadian Gas Association Canada, Thomas Clowes-Pritchard, Outreach Director of the Pinsker Center, Viktor Marsai, Director of the Migration Research Institute, and finally, Dr. Vidaković, from the CEO of Loti Trading. Gentlemen, take it away. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to this session. We're going to talk more about geoeconomics than geopolitics, I hope. And to that end, we're going to start with Timothy Egan of Canada Gas, who's going to tell us about the great situation, energy-wise, we're currently in.
Thank you, David, and thank you, John and Melissa and Istvan and everybody else here at the Danube Institute. It's a delight to be here. I was here at the first event earlier this year, and it's a pleasure to be invited back. I should note off the start that my official job is as president of the Canadian Gas Association, but I'm not speaking in that capacity. Here I'm speaking in a private capacity. But on the topic of energy security, and I'll try not to betray too strong a natural gas bias in my remarks. I understand that President Clowes may be joining us later, but I'm going to start by referencing another great Czech who some of you may have heard of, noted energy scholar Václav Šmil, who says that energy is the only universal currency, that it's necessary for getting anything done. And usually we think of it in very simple terms like whether the microphones come on or the lights work, but we don't regularly reflect on its critical importance for a host of other things. Everything from fertilizer for food, energy for commerce, for heavy industry, machines for the production of every single consumer good, refrigeration and heating, transport, the ability to manufacture the defense requirements that we talked about in the last session and yesterday, in some every aspect of human life. All societies have a profound interest, therefore, in energy security because they can't function as societies without energy. And a few current references make the point very clearly. So far this year, European governments have put in place an estimated 700 billion euros in citizen subsidies to underwrite energy costs because people can't afford their energy bills. The lack of access to fertilizer was instrumental in triggering the massive political crisis in Sri Lanka earlier this year. And while it wasn't per se an energy crisis, it was driven by the reality that fertilizer is overwhelmingly produced from natural gas. And Sri Lanka had decided it wanted to produce fertilizer organically. That didn't work. Farmer protests are occurring in many countries right now, again around fertilizer. And a recent factoid relevant to this topic is that rice production is expected to decline by 10% over the next season because of fertilizer costs. That represents 36 million tons of rice, which is enough to feed 500 million people. In October, chemical and fertilizer producer BASF warned that it might have to downsize permanently in Europe because of high energy prices, while energy-intensive industries such as glass making have voiced fears that companies could indefinitely move their operations to other countries with lower energy costs. And in North America, growing concerns about energy affordability are increasingly dominating the public discourse, dramatically impacting transport in the first instance because of higher gasoline prices, but also absolutely everything dependent on transport, which of course includes food. Energy security, in terms the consumer understands, needs to address three things: reliability, affordability, and acceptability, and I think in that order. And these terms apply to a nation-state's understanding of energy security as well, both because the citizenry not achieving these things will rapidly object, but also because a nation-state is quickly made vulnerable by the instability that comes when energy is no longer those three things. So if you want to undermine energy security as a malicious global actor on the world stage, as an ideological actor domestically, or even as a particularly aggressive competitor in the market, you could consider undermining any of these three legs of the energy security stool. You can undermine the reliability leg by exposing and taking advantage of an energy system's vulnerabilities. That's targeted attacks on supply, transmission, or delivery, blockading a well site, blowing up a pipeline, knocking down a transmission line, undertaking a cyber attack on energy system operations, protesting the movement of fuel waste, or not designing a system to withstand bad weather. All of these are examples of reliability being undermined, and you overcome them by ensuring resiliency. You build in safeguards, backup plans, alternative energy supplies, reserves, etc. You can undermine the affordability leg by undermining reliability, but also by forcing constraints, economic constraints principally, on fuel supply, by banning fuels or technologies and thereby forcing up costs, or by imposing onerous regulatory frameworks, or by not making those frameworks, however onerous they might be, timely, or by excessive taxation or dissuading investment in key supplies, or by picking favorite technologies or fuels and subsidizing them rather than letting the market advance technology. And you overcome threats to affordability by ensuring competitive markets and reducing market interference, by reducing taxes and eliminating subsidies and encouraging investment and innovation, and by building in resiliency. Now, acceptability is the third leg of the stool, and it's historically meant addressing very tangible concerns like NIMBYism or air quality, water impacts, waste production, land impacts, and safety issues. And you'd undermine it by pointing to problems in respect to any of these. Today, though, acceptability has become about the management of greenhouse gases because of concerns around climate change. And rare is the energy conversation today that doesn't quickly become a conversation about GHGs. And so energy acceptability has become a conversation about whether energy produces these emissions, which is considered unacceptable, or doesn't, which is considered acceptable. So the simplest and quickest way to undermine acceptability of an energy option today is to talk about how significant its GHG emissions are, and to constantly remind the listener about any number of possible implications of those emissions being produced, however tenuous the link to those implications, such as floods, fires, hurricanes, drought, biodiversity declines, or even political instability. All today are being blamed on GHG emissions. Overcoming the challenges to acceptability is arguably the most difficult leg of the stool to handle, and it requires reducing the impacts of the various unacceptable behaviors and then mitigating the risks of the impacts that remain, because there will always be impacts. But it also requires public understanding and education, and doing that in respect to GHGs remains an enormous, indeed at times overwhelming challenge. Now, looking at the world at the beginning of the 21st century, human civilization would be seen as at an extraordinarily high point in terms of what it's achieved in ensuring reliable, affordable, and acceptable energy. We have massive supply. We're using more coal and oil and natural gas, the three foundational fuels of the energy system. In fact, combined, they represent roughly 75% of our total energy use. We use more than ever before, but the supply picture for all three continues to improve. We've created safe nuclear technology and are rapidly advancing small applications of it. We've long mastered hydroelectric, solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass technologies and continue to tweak improvements in them. And we're doing more and more innovative work on the possibilities of hydrogen. In sum, energy supply is not at risk. On transmission and delivery, we're rapidly improving our capacity to manage both in both individual countries and across the planet. And the most recent innovation there is the rapid expansion of LNG transport, quickly turning what was a series of regional gas markets into a single global market. And we dramatically improved end-use technologies and access to them so that more citizens around the world, a larger percentage than at any time in human history, have ready access to heating, cooling, hot water, transportation, electricity, etc. And all of these over multiple pathways. So as solid fuel delivery, as liquid fuel delivery, both of those usually by truck or boat or train, as gaseous fuel delivery through pipelines, and as electricity over wire. And yet, despite all of this, we're in the midst of an energy crisis. Prices are rising dramatically and show no signs of decline. Investment in core conventional fuels is not keeping pace with growth. Reliability is threatened, and there's talk of shortages, even in G7 economies, and public acceptability of virtually any energy fuel, technology, or pathway, at least in advanced industrial societies, seems incredibly low. So why is this the case? Well, there are malicious actors at fault. Mr. Putin's a study of energy geopolitics and a master propagandist. He's one. It shouldn't surprise anyone that open source information suggests Russian support for activists opposing fracking in Europe over the last decade. Xi Jinping is another, and like all great communists, he's a master at setting illusory targets and has set many for emissions reductions, all while building coal plants faster than just about anybody to generate cheap power that enables a manufacturing sector that's effectively undercutting the world. And he's also subsidizing rare earth metal global dominance in the process. And the Ayatollahs in Iran are another, and they've long known how to make sure their energy gets to markets despite sanctions, generating revenues to finance their activities around the world against their enemies. And they're ideological domestic actors who are at fault. Politicians in all our countries preach the morality of so-called energy transitions for political expediency, the negative implications of which will occur well beyond their political careers, so are of little consequence. Academics and bureaucrats and media personalities pontificate about the evil energy system of the West as they enjoy various sinecures, all the while availing themselves of the luxuries guaranteed by the energy system they condemn. And activists enjoy increasing subsidy by guilt-ridden or ill-informed funders while they demand more and more change to the energy system and less industrial development on the back of it. And there are aggressive market players at fault as well. The number of corporations in the West moralizing about how they really will achieve target X or Y and how this is critically important to their public service agendas of one kind or another, stakeholder capitalism in all its shades, can usually be found to be living hypocrisies of their own. But I'd argue that while these are all contributing factors, the greater cause is within the West's very own mindset. Having orchestrated the successful energy reality of the present moment, the West is now undermining it by a host of actions that are bringing and will continue to bring extraordinary hardship for millions, and with it, enormous potential for serious political instability. The West seems determined to look at the success of our energy system and call it failure, to look at the extraordinary quality of life achieved for millions and call it unjust, and to look at the remarkable reduction in lives lost from extreme weather events over the last century and still say the sky is falling. Now, it's notable that many countries outside of the traditional West are determined to take a different view. India is very clear in its intention to continue to burn coal to bring several hundred millions of people still in relative poverty in that country up to an acceptable standard of living. Middle Eastern countries are very clear in their intention to continue producing oil for the foreseeable future to drive their economic well-being. And African nations are clear that they see gas development and use as fundamental to improving the economic conditions of Africans. But those actions aren't changing the Western discourse, and so where does that leave us on energy security? Every indication is that concerted action by European countries over the last 6 months will guarantee that this winter will not spell the nightmare many had feared. A combination of efficiency programs, energy storage, and frankly, economic decline mean that this winter will be harsh but not destructive. But what of next winter and the one after that? With the global economy coming out of lockdowns and actually beginning to see signs of even slow economic growth, we have to anticipate dramatic increases in energy demand from other parts of the world. Demand that will put serious constraints on markets and make it much harder for Europe to find the energy it needs. Overall, global energy prices are likely to rise dramatically as investment in new development continues to be stymied by policies of developed countries and many of the companies in them on new development for the foundational fuels I mentioned. And the development of critical resources like rare earth minerals necessary for new technologies is going to be harmed by all of this, because the extraction of any of these resources requires enormous energy, and its cost rises as the cost of accessing that energy rises. This means, for instance, the price of electric cars will only go up. The economic pressure will increase demands of angry citizens for relief as their prices rise, as food shortages expand, and as the cost of other goods and services increase, which will push governments, right and left, to engage in yet more subsidization of energy costs, nationalization of assets, and all the protectionist bells and whistles that embodies. In other words, things don't look good. But what's required is a good dose of courageous realism about how energy systems work and how energy markets work, and the defense of same by strong leaders. As Dr. Carafano said yesterday, events like this matter because they remind people of these points. So here are a few suggestions. When there are cries for the elimination of fossil fuels, they need to be called out as being irresponsible. The mastery of fossil fuels remains one of the most significant advances in human development, enabling ready access to massive energy and with it massive opportunity for human civilization. Hundreds of millions have yet to achieve that and intend to pursue it, and this is objectively good. Hundreds of millions others who have it now are at threat of losing it if these fuels are threatened. Continued development of these resources, therefore, and improvement in their use is the right path, not their elimination. When there are concerns expressed about climate change as a crisis of apocalyptic proportions, these too need to be called out as irresponsible. Emissions are rising, and they have climate implications, but the suggestion that these are leading to an unmanageable crisis is at the very best debatable, but in my view, dubious and even dangerous. It fuels irresponsible policy and a culture of fear. Economic growth and the attendant innovation it has consistently delivered will again, left unrestrained by overbearing states, deliver enormous opportunity and innovation. The evidentiary record of improvements in quality of life and human ability to manage through crises speaks for itself and should give us confidence in what can be achieved. We should speak up on these points clearly. When there are cries for the complete restructuring of energy systems, such as the suggestion that we should ban the use of pipelines or make the internal combustion engine extinct, or that we can and should electrify everything, these too need to be called out as being disconnected from reality. On the electricity example, for instance, the technology amounts to roughly 20% of energy end use on the planet, and most of that is already dependent on fossil fuels, the fossil fuels that electrification advocates seek to eliminate. Electrifying the energy system would in many instances, like heavy industry, be effectively impossible, and it would fundamentally undermine reliability. Again, this needs to be called out and explained. And finally, when there are cries for more state intervention in the form of subsidies and taxes and the government control of energy assets, these need to be called out as never, ever working well. The end result is invariably the further stifling of advances in our energy systems, hurting economic well-being for the mass of humanity. Advancing on all of these is not a left-right political discourse today, at least not in conventional political terms. Politicians on all sides seem to be afraid to show leadership. The problem is about those who should know better, forgetting or being lazy about some fundamentals and losing the courage when they remember those fundamentals to stand up and defend them. We do have an energy crisis, and we shouldn't. It's going to create several years of real hardship because of mistakes we've made, but that could get even worse if we don't stand up now. We need to build affordability, reliability, and acceptability back into the energy policy framework in countries around the world and get back on a path to helping people everywhere live responsible lives as free and prosperous citizens. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that sobering insight into the sources of Western delusion. We now have Thomas Clowes-Pritchard talking about pipeline politics.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Danube Institute for having me and for giving myself and the Pinsker Centre, of which I'm Outreach Director, a platform at this fascinating conference. It is a great honour to be here in Budapest today. When people are free to choose, they choose freedom. I borrow these words from Margaret Thatcher because it is in her spirit that we seek to cement the bonds between our two countries, stand up to aggression from Russia, and defend democracy and freedom in Europe and around the world. One thing I would like to stress, and we'll be coming on to the pipeline in a second, and I hope that many in the room would agree with me, is that Britain's new place outside the European Union is not one of weakness, insignificance, or isolation, but one of a strong, engaged, and willful global power ready to protect our allies and are free from the bonds of the European Commission. And I would like to thank Hungary and the Hungarian people for being such a good friend to my country throughout that Brexit process. But it is to that end that we in the United Kingdom have supported Ukraine in their struggles, and why I would strongly encourage our friends here in Europe to do the same. And again, I would like to thank the Hungarian people for their contributions to this noble effort. But why do I say this? Because weakness invites aggression. We saw this with the Munich Agreement shortly before the Second World War. My country saw this more recently in the 1980s in the South Atlantic, shortly before Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. But do you remember where you were? Do you remember where you were when you heard that Russia had invaded Ukraine? Well, as for me, I had just landed at LAX from London. After the 11-hour flight, I turned on my phone. It was hot to touch, with the amount of news alerts, tweets, texts, missed calls. But the first person I called was Mummy, to let her know that my plane had arrived safely in Los Angeles. I said hello and that I arrived in LA safely, but that I felt that the American Airlines flight had not just crossed an ocean, but crossed into an alternative dimension with what I was seeing on my phone. Wherever we come across aggressive and expansionist regimes, we must pursue a policy of peace through strength. That means investing in our defences. I like to think of this as paying the premium on our home insurance. You know, we very much hope there isn't a fire next year, but just in case, we better be insured. But part of that peace through strength programme is that we prevent any kind of reliance on our adversaries for essential goods such as food and energy supply. This last one has been a source of contention throughout Europe and around the world. The free world is overly reliant on Russia for oil and natural gas, when there are readily available alternatives. And you might ask, Tom, why do they do this? I'm glad you asked that, because I've got the answer. Perhaps the most promising one is the proposed EastMed pipeline, which, if built, will carry natural gas from gas fields in the exclusive economic zones of Israel and Cyprus through to Greece and then on to Italy afterwards. With this option, everyone is a winner. Israel and Cyprus increase natural gas export and create jobs for Israelis and Cypriots. Cyprus can reaffirm their territorial maritime integrity. Greece and Italy can create new jobs for Greeks and Italians with new energy supply. Hungary and other European nations can have more stable, secure, and friendly nations supplying natural gas. Russian gas companies are left with fewer global customers. And above all, Europe can use this as a catalyst to build profound relationships between our countries and Israel. And hey, if the only losers in this deal are Turkey and Russia, then I think we're on to a winner, ladies and gentlemen. The proposed EastMed pipeline is one of 3 proposed pipelines. The other 2 are the Trans-Caspian pipeline, which would go under the Caspian Sea, and the Trans-Saharan pipeline, which, unsurprisingly, would go through the Sahara. The Trans-Caspian pipeline would go under the Caspian Sea and then would be connected to the Southern Gas Corridor. However, the Russian government can then legally object to the construction of a project in the Caspian Sea on environmental grounds. And of course, we all know this is a charade for Russia. It's not necessarily caring about the global environment, but about their own interests and about their own backyard. So the Trans-Caspian pipeline is arguably, for those very reasons, a non-starter. So let's look at the Trans-Saharan pipeline then. On the other hand, it could prove slightly more viable. Algeria is not the most pro-Israel country in the world, but it is relatively politically stable, particularly compared to some of her neighbours in the region. What is more is that Algeria already supplies a large amount of energy to Europe, and back in the summer they signed an agreement with Italy to boost supply. However, the Trans-Saharan pipeline would begin in Nigeria, pass through Niger and Algeria before coming to Europe. But due to instability in and around Niger, as well as the activities of terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, in the region, the project was delayed indefinitely, having first been proposed in 2002. To put that into context, I was a very small child and far too busy watching Thomas the Tank Engine and playing with stuffed penguins when that was first proposed. So the EastMed pipeline really is the most politically viable option available to Europe for alternative energy supply. The pipeline from the Leviathan and Aphrodite gas fields off the coast of Israel and Cyprus, respectively, would have a capacity of 12 billion cubic metres per year. That's 4% of the EU's total imports, the equivalent of. This could go a long way to giving European nations the ability to import gas from Cyprus and Israel rather than from Russia. I thank you so very much for your time. Thank you for having me at the Danube Institute. Melissa and John, thank you for inviting me. We at the Pinsker Centre are due to publish a report on this topic, on the EastMed pipeline and alternatives available to Europe for energy. That will be available in January. Please do stay in touch with me. I'd love you to come to the launch. I'd love you to read our report. And with that little bit of shameless self-promotion out of the way, I look forward to our discussion in a few moments. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Thomas. Next, we have Viktor Marsai, Director of Migration Research Institute in Hungary, talking about no wheat in sight and the problems of the Ukraine war for wheat globally.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome for everybody, and thank you for the Danube Institute and the organizer that inviting me for this panel discussion. In this 15, a little bit more, 20 minutes, I will speak on Africa. I'm an Africanist in the Institute. I'm following mainly the African migration and the root causes of the African migration. And of course, I'm not naive. And if we are honest, we must confess that Africa is neither a priority in Washington, nor in Beijing, nor in Moscow. But the other side of the story is that it's a very important continent for Europe, not only for the possibilities, but also for the challenges which are coming from Africa. Because if you have a look for the different phenomena in the last years, we see directly that the challenges and threat of the African continent, and which reach beyond the continent, is not for Washington, not for Beijing, not for Moscow, but European capital. So this is why it's an important reason why in a European capital in Budapest, I think it's very important to speak on this topic. Africa became a all new theater of geopolitical competition. It's a well-known fact, just a quotation for General Townsend, the former commander of US AFRICOM, who confessed and declared in the testimony that there is ongoing strategic competition within the continent with Africa and Russia, and it remains the most important threat for the American interest, and we can add that also for the European interest. And we can be naive. For Moscow, the continent perhaps is not so important in economic and security and other terms. But to hurt Europe across different actions in the continent, it's very valuable, makes it very valuable assets in the hands of different Russian interests. And we can say, if you have a look at the last years, that Russia pursued a very successful political, economic, and to some extent security campaign in Africa, using soft power and not so soft power in the continent. In the first map, you can see, for instance, military and economic cooperation in the continent. Almost all African capital has some kind of economic or military agreement with Moscow. And in the second map, you can see the activity or the last activity of Wagner Group in the continent. And in the next slide, you can see that this activity and these efforts were successful. If you have a look at the voting of the UN General Assembly on the aggression of Russia and later the participation of the Human Rights Council of Russia in the UN, we see that it was successful. Yes, we can see that if not the Cold War, but some kind of Cold War is ongoing in different parts of the world. To say at least Africa is deeply divided along the line. And although the rejection was not so many, mainly the first voting, but you see many countries abstaining during the vote, even countries which previously we considered a stable Western alliance, this perspective. Okay, so this is first about the whole geopolitical and competition background for this story, but I will deliver this afternoon, yes, already, for you, and some aspects of the crisis which is ongoing now, Africa, in this food security issue. So what's the situation on the ground now? Globally, according to UN estimations, almost 350 million people are on acute food insecurity, partially because of the war in Ukraine. And 137 million people from this are currently in Africa. Globally, Mr. Putin contributed 500 million people to add for food insecurity after the invasion of Ukraine. Now the number is around 1.6 billion. And what we see now in the continent in the last 2 years, and this story, bless you, Ukraine was just the last straw that broke, not the camels, but African back was the Ukrainian crisis. Deep structural crisis is ongoing on the continent, and we don't see the light at the end of this tunnel. Some words about the challenges, first the structural challenges and the political and short-term challenges of Africa, which contributed to the food insecurity and the continental food crisis. In Africa, demography is, of course, a very important reason. We all of us knows how population boom is still ongoing in the continent, and it will continue in the next decade until the end of this century, with the exception of UFO attack. And COVID-19 only contributed to the deepening of this crisis. We have a lot of words about increasing food prices today. We should keep in our mind that it started not after 24th of February this year, but it has been ongoing since May 2020. Before the war in Ukraine, different foodstuffs, the price of different foodstuffs increased by between 50 and 100% in different parts of the continent. When I visited Mali in last November before the invasion, even that time people complained me for the increasing food prices of different reasons. It means currently that in many households, it means tens of millions of households, people spending between 60 and 100% of their income for food to avoid starvation, which in many cases, it means that they have to make a decision whether feeding the sick kid or buying medicine for the one who is sick. So it's sometimes it led to very brutal decisions on the field. We should mention the drought in close connection with the climate change issue. In East Africa, four rainy seasons missed in the last 2 years, and it seems now in the end of November also the fifth rainy season passed without significant rain. In some regions, between 80 and 95% of the livestock has already perished. And contrary to agricultural cultivation, we should keep in our mind to give enough time for the herds to recover. It's not just one rainy season, it is between 7 and 10 years. But unfortunately, many nomads don't have so much time, because likely, if following the patterns, the next big drought will come within 3 or 4 years. So actually, there's no time for recovery for the pastoral economies. We see also a big drought in West Africa after in the last months rains arrived, but there's no tanks in it because there were torrential rains and huge floods, displacing more than 30 million people in the region. reserves were used during the pandemic, both in the governmental budget and in the families. So there's no resources to somehow gap the economic burden which was caused by the inflation. And we see in different theaters from Ethiopia across Somalia to Burkina Faso that different actors utilizes starvation and famine as weapons to stabilize their control and political positions in these theaters. There was in previous excellent lecture on energy price shock. I just show the numbers, very important to keep in mind. There are also a discussion whether is it possibilities for different African actors, but as we can heard in connection with the pipelines, which is a ongoing thinking in Europe that will build huge pipelines for gas and oil for different Sahara regions, well, even the best conditions, it will take years, if not decades, to realize it. And perhaps not accidental, ladies and gentlemen, again, that, the different Russian military engagement in the Sahara region, Mali, and now Burkina Faso, is very, very near to these planned pipelines. Political challenges, there are all the new civil wars in the continent, which also contributes to the crisis in South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and different parts of the Sahel, and an increasing political instability, not independently from this perfect storm in the region. We saw 6 military coups or coup attempt in West Africa just in the last 2 years, which is very unique in the history of Africa after the 2020s, when Africa shifted from the military dictatorship to more democratic regimes. Actually, it was a shock, not only for the outside world who consider that Africa is on a stable path on democratization, but also for regional organizations, for example, the Economic Cooperation of West African countries, which impose very strict sanctions on the regime which committed military coups there. And the last row, Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps you saw how many African countries imported its wheat and other foodstuffs from Ukraine and Russia, which almost totally collapsed after 24th of February. Some actors managed to find other solutions and other alternative sources for supply, for example, Egypt, which managed to cope with these challenges, and many other countries which has more or less stable governments, some financial background for it. But of course, the biggest crisis zone, when there are fragile or we can say collapse states from Somalia to South Sudan to Mali, they can't cope with this challenge without the support of foreign actors and institutions. We shouldn't forget the other effects of the war in Ukraine. For example, the aspect of tourism. Back to Egypt, 25% of the guests who visited different hotels and Egypt inside the tourists before the war came for Ukraine and Russia. And most of these sources now are empty and people stay at home, both in Ukraine and Russia, because of the war. It means that hundreds of thousands of employees lost or possibly lost their job in Egypt. And in general, ladies and gentlemen, between 7 and 8% of the whole GDP of Africa is coming from tourism. In some countries, Maldives, for example, Kenya, is between 10 and 25%. And you can imagine that how COVID-19 affected this industry, which depleted it almost totally. It started to slowly recover at the end of last year, and now they again found themselves on the floor. Ukraine and Russia are not among the biggest investors in the continent, but altogether it also meant hundreds of thousands of jobs all around of the continent. Now all of them are in danger, and we can see also less political attention, both from, in some aspect, Russia and from the foreign world. Of course, we are concentrating mainly what's going on in our direct neighborhood, But among these conditions, it's also a threat and challenge for Africa in perhaps not short, but medium and long term, how we deal with the consequences of the current happenings. And it would be great that if we will not face the consequences when it's now in our border or within our countries, but perhaps to deal with it on the African continent, of course. And I mentioned you this new Cold War competition. Okay, there are many debates, how it's ongoing, what's the characteristic, what's the similarities and differences between the Cold War. But actually this competition is very evident if we look at the different African actors. What's the current situation, ladies and gentlemen? Mass starvation since June. Because most area where the famine is ongoing, even if the United Nations haven't declared still officially famine, but according local reports, it's ongoing. Nobody knows how many people have already died. Even conservative estimations, according to conservative estimations, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people have already died. An Oxfam report, it came out 1.5 years ago, stated that because of malnutrition and the consequences of malnutrition and famine, 20,000 people are dying daily in the continent. We can't verify it, but the problem is ongoing. What is very evident, the increasing number of IDPs within the continent. Only in Somalia, since the beginning of this year, 1 million people have left their home and went to the centers which are under the control of the government to find some shelter and food. But unfortunately, there's not enough food and shelter for these people. And what's the new phenomenon in the last 3-4 months, that not only internally displaced person, but also international refugees started to flow within Africa. For example, in the context of East Africa, almost 60,000 Somali refugees arrived to the Dadaab refugee complex in Kenya. And until the end and the beginning of the next year, UNHCR was waiting an additional 60,000 people only to this one refugee camp in Kenya. From the sub-Saharan Africa until this point, we haven't seen people leaving the continent. Of course, there's a very simple reason. Who are starving to death, don't have money to pay for the smuggling networks. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of euros and dollars to reach the Mediterranean coast and after Europe. But from the middle class of North Africa, if you're checking the data of Frontex agency, European Border and Border Control Patrol agencies, we see that the middle class of North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, lesser extent Algeria and Morocco, started to leave the continent. It's from the Frontex website. You see as darker green is the countries more people's living and crossing illegally the border of the European Union. From the 5 North African states, almost 60,000 people arrived, mainly across the Mediterranean Sea, lesser extent in different borders, land borders, and only 25,000 from the sub-Saharan Africa. So we can see now that the North African middle class, or some part of it, decided to leave towards Europe. And what's the conclusion which we can make? As I mentioned, Africa is ongoing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, at least in the last 45 years. In the shadow of the war in Ukraine, there is very limited hope that the continent will get more support to tackle this crisis. I just would like to highlight two data. The first ship which could leave Odessa port and arrive to East Africa, it happened late August. It brought 23,000 tons of wheat and different food stock, which is enough for the feed of 1.5 million people for 2 months. Huge numbers, 1.5 million people for 2 months. The only problem is that currently in East Africa, 20 million people need humanitarian assistance. And another number, the US aid, we also heard this day, offered $800 million just for Somalia in the last 4 months, which is also enough for the feed of 2 million people for 3 months. But currently, 7.5 million people need food assistance in the country. So there are many challenges, and there is huge need for additional support. And in the perspective of Europe, while we are struggling a lot of challenges, energy, inflation, etc., refugees from Ukraine, we should also focus on the southern direction, the incoming people, and losing space against Russia and China. The latest sign of it was, if you follow the news, the French withdrawal for Mali and the French declaration by President Macron 2 weeks ago that France will leave the Sahel or with most of its fighting forces, led the theater more or less for Russia. So we can see it's a geopolitical other moment for Russia, which can be utilized to weaken the alliance and weaken Europe in a very challenging time. So thank you very much. I finish now and I give the floor to the next panelist.
Well, now that I'm given a microphone, I might just as well walk. As a professor, I always hated these things where I got to stand. Anyway, once again, thank you for inviting me. It was truly a pleasure. And you know how they say that, financial markets are in turmoil? Well, I'm one of the guys that participates and creates turmoil. So they wanted, Mr. and Madam O'Sullivan proposed the topic of financial flows and supply chain politics. And we're going to be talking a lot about these flows, how things move around. Do I press for the next slide? The green? Okay. So this is the world as we know it today. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about, and the only thing I'm going to be talking about, is economics. I don't do politics. I don't do geostrategy. And the previous panel has opened my eyes on a lot of topics. I'm very grateful to the previous panelists as well as my colleagues. But if you look at the terms of the way the world is structured, basically G7 is a Snow White and some dwarfs. And this is not a derogatory terms. It is one of the, if not the greatest accomplishments in history of economics, is to have close to 4 or 5% of population, which is US, producing 25% of world goods. That's an unimaginable feat in terms of productivity and economics. But that was when G7 was started in the 70s and came out in the 80s. But what happened recently? What happened over the last 20 years? Well, the cool kids, had their own group, but the other global powers were, I put here deliberately excluded, because I've never heard of, let's include India and China. So what did the other kids do? Well, they created their own club. And this is basically, like I said here, it's your basic high school principles. You don't include the other kids that formed their own club. So now let's see this in terms of actual sizes. So if you look at how big is G7, and then if you even include EU, because you have representatives of EU, and you have the other side, which is only 4 countries, the so-called BRIC countries, well, if you sum this up and you take out US, you basically get this number, which means that the other group has now become significant and large. It has become strategically important. If you took these numbers, 10 years ago, the China and India were not that big. But now they're growing, and they're growing even more, which means that sooner or later, and this is what we're seeing right now, this group is going to do 2 things. One thing is it's going to strengthen economically, and then second thing is, as we have heard from the previous panel, they're going to ask, well, we would like to be heard. We would like to be also important. Now, how this is going to play out, I don't know. I participate in financial markets. I'll leave this to everyone else. But just, if you look at the sizes, plus some other new friends that want to join the group, this is not small. It's not irrelevant. And on top of that, up to recently, you've been hearing how Chinese own a lot of American debt. Well, actually, that's not true anymore. If you look at the last 6 months or a year, Chinese central bank has been precipitously decreasing the amount of US debt it holds. So let's do flows, global trade and communication in general. So how does stuff moves? Well, stuff moves mostly through ships. So these nice people at AB and Ambro, they created something called our Global Supply Bottlenecks Index. Basically, this means is how busy everyone is. So if you look at this, and if you look at this period here, let's call it 15, 16, and then it moves to 17, 18, this was the period of really, really nice economic setup. And I'll say nice because maybe you remember at that time, you had that famous phrase, a synchronized global business cycle. So you had a small slowdown in 15 and 16, and then in 17, everyone started to move up. And this is actually what you want. You want bottlenecks. Because what is a bottleneck? It means there's a lot of demand for traffic. A lot of demand for traffic means a lot of trade. A lot of trade means a lot of business, a lot of economy. If you look at the worst calculation, well, this was in 12. And what was going on in 12? Well, everyone was questioning the existence of Europe. You know, what is going to happen with Euro? What will happen to Greece? Will the Euro survive? Will the European Union survive? But if you look at the trend, this is where you're going. You're basically seeing a continuous decrease in business activity, in flow of goods. So the world has changed. Now, if you look at other things like global volatility, it has exploded. And if you look at PMI export, it has been decreasing, which basically covers the previous slide. You have less and less communication, less and less flow of goods, less and less economic activity. So what we heard on a previous panel, that the world is changing, that the world order is changing, I have already seen here. Right? The world has changed. Economic data is telling me that. There isn't that much flow of goods anymore. So now that we're done with the real economics, the trade, let's do some financial stuff. Now, what you have here are the pictures of 10-year bonds. And these 10-year bonds are German, Italian, and French. And if you see here, right around the beginning of the year, the prices collapsed. Now, I have a degree in math and I enjoy mathematics. I enjoy a lot of sophisticated models. But 90% of my analysis and conclusions comes from supply and demand. So let's do supply. That's real easy. Because if you look at here, this is European Central Bank's securities for monetary purposes. Well, the ECB bought around 240 billion of euros of bonds. So that's demand. What about the supply? Well, if you look at public debt, and this is Eurozone, not European Union, it has increased by around 350, which means only 100 billion bonds were produced, which is 1% of GDP. And this is first half of this year. So you do not have a huge production. You do not have a huge supply. And yet, you have enormous decline in prices. Now you can say, well, Neven, but the price of US bonds also decreased a lot. Yes, but if you do the same analysis, in this period, Federal Reserve has started to sell bonds and has become a producer of bonds, and the US deficit, how much bonds were produced, is considerably larger. So if you look at the magnitudes, based on supply and demand, these magnitudes are a lot bigger. Okay. But, raising interest rates, these things happened. Let's see what next slide brings. Oh, looky here. You have a collapse of euro. Why do you have that? you have that European currency has decreased by almost 20% in slightly under a year. Now, what I've been hearing from Croatian central bank governor as an incredibly important argument to join the euro is the fact that euro is a global reserve currency. Well, if it's so global and so reserve and so important, how come nobody wants it? So what are you seeing? You're seeing less trade, less demand for financial assets, less demand for currency, and all of a sudden, if you look at trade deficit, it has exploded into negative. Now, this cannot be just oil and natural gas, because keep in mind, Russia was supplying natural gas for some months after the invasion, and price of oil is basically unchanged since the beginning of the year. So what we have painted here is a decline of economic activity, a serious decline of economic activity that is not coming only from war in Ukraine or from restrictive monetary policy. So what do we have as a simple explanation? Economy is weakening, and currency and financial assets are no longer desirable. And this brings us to the most important point. There are years where the world changes. And again, I'm not into political scientists. I'm not into history. I'm looking at strictly economics. Now, these years, which I have deliberately outlined, this is the financial crisis because of which Fed was founded. This is the financial crisis of 29. This is the end of depression when inflation spiked back up in 46. This is the entrance into stagflation. This is the end of stagflation. This is a move into a 29 depression and 21. So last year, European and American economy have been propelled out of low interest rate equilibrium into a higher interest rate, higher inflation equilibrium that nobody is adjusting to. And what's the worst part about inflation? It's not the rise in prices, and it's not the loss of standard. It is the fact that inflation has significant redistributive effects. If inflation goes unchecked for a significant period of time, it dismantles the structure of the economy. This was what stagflation was. Stagflation, by definition, is simple. Oh, you have higher inflation and low economic growth. But why did it last for 10 years? And how it was broken? Huge interest rates, but with fiscal support. Reagan, you do not have the capacity for fiscal support this time, and higher interest rates will cause a bankrupt of pretty much everyone in Europe. So the situation is really serious. Now, it can be solved. It's not a problem. Last time I was here, I proposed a solution how to solve euro. And Mr. Jones was kind enough to propose that I write up a short paper on it. No problem. But it's being unchecked. Now, why is it being unchecked? And again, the explanation is incredibly simple. You have a failure of leadership and failure of values. Again, I'll stick with the central bank. You have a central bank governor, Christine Lagarde, that behaves like a politician. First, she was in a coalition with inflation. Remember those words, inflation is transitory, inflation doesn't exist, there's no point in raising interest rates. Well, now she says, oh, the inflation hasn't peaked yet. A month ago, she said that inflation, after rising for almost 24 months, was completely unforeseen. On flip side, I will venture a little into politics. Borrell said the sixth package of sanctions against Russia will be smart sanctions, which by definition means the first five were stupid sanctions. I don't know, that's logic. And then, what are values? I wanted to buy an office space. I have to fill out 7 forms. On those 7 forms in a bank, each form has exactly the same 10 data points, which means over-regulation. Everything has a problem can be solved with another bureaucratic Brussels central agency and another form. That's not how the world works. Well, maybe it works, but then you have all the previous slides. So how do you solve this, and how do you solve this? Well, failure of leadership is easy to solve. You don't lie. You be honest with yourself, you be honest with your allies. That's in my business is really simple. Every day you wake up, you see the state of your account, are you making money, are you losing money? And then we have this. How do you solve the failure of values? Well, my predecessor actually demonstrated that about an hour and a half ago. That lady over there in a pink scarf came, and 2 people immediately rose up and offered her a seat. I don't think that would happen at a Vogue conference. But the way I see it, in terms of values, things are incredibly simple. As long as you have the courage to stand up to evil and respect for your elders, you're pretty much okay on the values front. Thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and thank you to the members of our panel. It is now my privilege to introduce former Prime Minister as well as the former President of the Czech Republic. Sir, welcome, and thank you very much for your time.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, John, Melissa, and all the others. I'm sorry for changing the program because I was asked by the Prime Minister Orbán, to spend 1 hour with him now, so I'm late. I'm sorry. Viktor Orbán is my good friend for almost 30 years now, and at one moment we were, both of us were vice presidents of the EDU. Some of you remember European Democratic Union, which was the umbrella organization of right of center political parties in Europe. We were both vice presidents, so we spent in the 1990s many conferences and meetings together. I always accused him that he was in favor of center-right parties, and I attacked him dramatically all the time that I'm in favor of right of center parties. That was a deep dispute between 2 of us, not irrelevant, I would say. So many thanks for inviting me to attend this conference, for offering me the privilege to speak here, for giving me a chance to meet good old friends, and last but not least, to be in Budapest again, in this city and country that plays such a courageous and much needed role in the brave new world of contemporary Europe, which is approaching the Aldous Huxley system very rapidly. I am frustrated that my country, with its current political representation, is not able to do the same as Hungary. I accepted the topic of the speech, rebuilding a stable world economy, without the slightest hesitation, which didn't prove to be very wise. When I started preparing notes for my today's presentation, I found out that the topic is much more challenging than it seemed to me. When listening to my predecessor, to the other speakers in this session, I'm afraid I will be less technical and less statistical, in spite in spite of the fact that I used to spend 10 years of my life as econometrician doing macroeconometric models, so I know something about it, but it's over. Speaking about a stable world economy doesn't mean discussing a well-defined and well-structured topic. It has many dimensions belonging to different disciplines, to several social sciences. And there is no simple textbook wisdom covering this topic because there can't be any. No hard data can help, no sophisticated econometric models. I can't therefore promise more than offering more than a few elementary remarks of an innocent ex-politician. That's probably a fair and correct description of my position and my situation. Perhaps my personal experience and my country's perspective can be of some help, at least I hope. My experience can be summarized as 40 years of communism, a very hopeful, fascinating decade of radical transformation in top political positions in my country, and now much less satisfying 2 decades of living in a very special entity called the European Union. Some of you may have heard about my regretfully unsuccessful efforts to block the European democracy, nation states, and European economy devastating Lisbon Treaty, but as some of you remember, I failed in this respect. This mixture of my experiences may be useful, at least I hope. It's almost unique. My perspective is also relevant. A small Central European country, a country without any geopolitical ambitions, a heavily industrialized country. We are still the share of people employed in industry in the Czech Republic is highest in Europe. No one mentions that. A country without access to the sea and without sufficient domestic reserves of natural resources. So this is my starting point. All of that is on my mind. This session is supposed to discuss the ways which can contribute to the rebuilding a stable world economy. This is for me a rather illusory, if not entirely misplaced goal. John, I don't know who created the title. Melissa, probably. It sounds constructivistically for me. And we, with our artificially created communist past, are very cautious about such an ambition. Is rebuilding a world economy a meaningful task? Whose task should it be? Who should get the mandate to rebuild the world economy? A new central planner, a digitalized one today, these days. People like me tend to argue that promises of building or rebuilding a stable world economy belongs to the UN or perhaps the IMF plenary sessions, not to the Danube Institute gatherings. My assumption is that we who are here today don't believe in global masterminding of the economy and are not interested in playing the role of advisors. Speaking for myself, I am certainly not motivated to give prescriptive recommendations. There is no one listening anyway. In spite of that, I am not forgetting that I promised to say a few words on this topic. Let me concentrate on two of the many very diverse dimensions of this issue. The first topic, which was partly discussed in the last two contributions, is the role of the shifts of the world economy centers of gravity. We saw some data here. To speculate about potential and probable shifts of the world economy centers of gravity in the foreseeable future is one possible approach. The ongoing trends and tendencies are well known and were mentioned here, and they are so undisputable that it's not necessary to bring statistical data. The gravity center of the world economy is shifting eastwards. The original centers, Europe and North America, have been evidently losing their previous positions in the last decades, especially Europe. Similar data as were shown here. In my data, in the 1990s, the US and Western Europe controlled almost 70% of the world GDP. It's only 43% now. Your data were very similar. This shift is enormous and will continue. When I look at the European economy being strangled by overregulation, overtaxation, ridiculous green imperatives, and the intrusive behavior of the EU bureaucracy, it is evident that Europe cannot grow. It is condemned to stagnation. This is, and the data prove it, this is not surprisingly what we are experiencing now. It's even worse, we are stagflating. The policy based on the ideology of great moderation, so fashionable 2 decades ago, produced rates of inflation unknown for decades. In my country, for the whole century. My country escaped the German-like inflation after the First World War, and we escaped the Hungarian type of inflation after the Second World War. So just now we have the highest inflation ever in the history of the Republic. The so much heralded, sophisticated theories and models were all wrong, not just the almost unbelievable, ridiculous concept of the new monetary theory. By contrast, China, India, and the BRICS or BRICS-like non-Western countries are and will continue moving ahead. To say this is neither new nor revolutionary. It has become already part of the mainstream orthodoxy. The differing growth rates of the West and the East, perhaps plus the South, will not have neutral consequences. Shifts of that kind destabilize the existing structures and undermine the old stability. In a growing economy, it can lead to a positive sum game. In a stagnating or even declining economy, it will bring the opposite. Historical experience tells us that such developments often brought about conflicts and wars. Similar conflicts and wars can be expected to happen in the foreseeable future. Ukraine is just one example. This will certainly not improve the current fragile stability of the world economy. Growth of the world economy does not, of course, depend on geographical shifts to faster growing regions only. This is valid in spite of the fact that the unprecedented growth of the Chinese economy in the last 4 decades has undoubtedly contributed to the rapidly growing world GDP. This factor seems to be mainly or partly exhausted now. I agree with, I recently read in the International Economy, Richard Jerem saying the entry of China into the global trading system was essentially a one-off shift and seems to have run its course. So, in my understanding, it's unrepeatable. Given the recent political, social, and cultural changes in China and the relatively high degree of its economic maturity, not to mention its more than serious graying problem, there is no reason to expect China to continue growing rapidly in the next decades. Will other non-Western countries take over China's previous role? Will the West itself be able to do it? This is not what I should bet on. So this is the first dimension of my looking at it. Second one is something which has not been mentioned very often here, and this is the role of the quality of the economic system. You mentioned leadership and visions. I would prefer talking about the quality of the economic system. The worldwide economic growth and its stability are in the long run based on something else than geographical shifts. Definitely not on science or technology, as it is irresponsibly proclaimed by very loudly speaking technocrats and non-economists of all kinds, but on the efficiency of the economic system. This is my main argument, which is the emphasis on the quality of the economic system. In this respect, there is, however, no reason for optimism either. As a citizen and as an economist, I spent decades of my life in a system where the economy was not autonomous, but dictated by a prioristic political imperatives. This was the lesson which was deeply rooted in our minds. 50 years ago, in August 1968, in the week when Warsaw-Pact armies invaded Czechoslovakia, I published my article where I dared openly discuss special relationship between politics and the economy in the communist society. It was published just the same week, irrationally. This topic was, of course, for the next 2 decades, forgotten, at least in my country. We returned to it after the fall of communism. This era is usually understood as the reconstructed rebirth of the market economy in poor part of the world. Yes and no. Yes and no. The decisive change was the breaking the ruinous link between politics and the economy. The getting rid of the dominance of politics, the rebirth of the market economy was a consequence. The market cannot be constructed. In the communist centrally administered economy, the economic system, the economy had to follow politics. This brings me to my main question. Was it specific for communism? Can't it be repeated even without an old-fashioned communism? Aren't we already moving in the same direction now? Aren't the new ideologies or isms leading to the emergence of a similar system again? Looking at it with my experience and from my perspective, I consider this an imminent danger of the current era. The autonomy of the economy in my country, in the EU, and in the whole West has been visibly suppressed, evidently and resolutely since the 2008-2009 crisis. What were the main causes of this development? I will concentrate on 4 of them, which I see as the crucial ones. First, After the fall of communism, we assumed that the old social imperative, coming from the old-fashioned Marxist perspective, had already lost its strength. This belief of ours was strengthened when looking at the evidently declining power of trade unions. As we see it now, it was both a wrong analysis and wishful thinking on our side. We are witnessing that the imperative of equality has regained a new strength, not just in the economic sphere. The idea of equality is used as a justification for new forms of political interference into the economy. Again, their consequences are no less dangerous than in the past. They are irresponsibly underestimated by almost everyone now because they look like not having any direct connection with communism, which is a misplaced way of looking at it. Second, in the last 50 years, since the publication of the Clubs of Rome Bible, The Limits to Growth, a new political, which means non-economic imperative has emerged based on the tenets of green ideology, of environmentalism. It fatally suppresses economic rationality and, as a consequence, the efficiency of the economy. It fundamentally alters the quality of the economic system and undermines economic growth and development. No one of today's politically correct green slogans can be defended on rationality grounds. They have no basis in science. They are political and a prioristic and purposefully destructive. Accidentally, I started preparing my notes for this speech, for my today's presentation, on the day of the opening session of the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Change Summit. The scandalous statement of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the world is, I quote, on a highway to climate hell is not worth commenting upon here, at least I suppose. Such political stances transformed into policy do change the economic system. The new banking criteria for evaluating investment projects and for granting loans, the so-called ESG system, are contrary to the economic way of thinking. Regretfully, the economists don't protest sufficiently loudly. They prefer easy ways of getting their PhDs and getting generous grants. My third point, the third fundamental blow to the economic efficiency and to the economic performance is the acceleration of the transition from shareholding to stakeholding. This explained the irrational and arrogant views of leading business people on many current, not just economic issues. Their behavior undermines the substance of the market economy and of the functioning of the system of property rights. This process, of course, started to be discussed more than half a century ago, but has reached, in my understanding, a new strength in recent years. The profit maximization, this symbol of economic efficiency, has been more or less dismissed as politically incorrect. This fundamentally undermines the possibility of healthy and stable economic growth. And my final point, and I will not prolong the debate, you are hungry, I'm absolutely sure already, and somebody is calling. And my final point, the whole idea of our transition from communism to free markets was based on free trade, on the rejection of protectionism, on the abolition of state monopoly on foreign trade, on the criticism of building geographically restricted trade blocks, etc. This was the substance of our thinking 33 years ago. By the way, one of the most important and risky decisions of my early political career as Minister of Finance was the liberalization of foreign trade in my country on January the 1st, 1991. There was a radical and fundamental shift, and that shift rapidly changed the functioning of the economy. What we see now is the emergence or re-emergence of politically motivated neo-protectionism and of new forms and arguments of political promotion of trade blocs. This I see as a fatal attack on free trade. Not accidentally, I don't often use the fashionable term globalization because it's not an economic term. No economist should use this term. It belongs to journalism and TV talk shows. It can't be economically defined, I prefer speaking about increasing or decreasing internationalization of economic activities. That's almost the same, but the substance is different. This, of course, sounds politically incorrect now because it implies a nation or a nation state to be the original entity, the starting reference point. And this way of thinking is not fashionable these days. Therefore, they prefer to talk about globalization now. As regards the so-called globalization, it becomes evident, and it was touched in the previous contribution, that the technological and supply chain complexities are reaching that globalization due to the technological and supply chain complexities is reaching its natural limits. We should therefore pay more attention to the rationality of domestic policies. Let's return to the defense of openness, freedom of movement, free trade, and liberalized capital flows. Let's not discuss it ideologically only. Put together, all above mentioned leads to we discussed it last night during the dinner, it leads to my pessimism as regards the possibility of healthy worldwide economic growth and development in the foreseeable future. And as I indicated at the beginning, without economic growth, there can't be stability of the world economy. To rephrase my predecessor, his last sentence was, if I'm not wrong, the situation is really serious. I fully agree that the situation is really serious, and no naive and wishful thinking can help us in this respect. Thank you for your attention.